Let's start working on the business layer. We already have the getAntelope collection method from the Antelope repository. In the business layer, we can inject this repository into one of our model classes in order to read the data from the persistence layer and expose this data through our facade. Let's take a look inside the Spryker to see if we have a command in order to create a reader at the business layer. As you can see, we have this command, add zDomain entity reader. If we execute this command, then it's going to ask us on what module we want to enter to create the reader. In this case, is the Antelope module. Then the name of the entity that we want to read, in this case, is Antelope. After that, you can see that a factory is going to be created by this script in order to create an instance of the reader. So it needs the name of the interface for type hinting the return type. Let's give it an interface name, and the naming convention is name of the entity, reader, and then interface. The next thing that we have to insert is on what layer we want to create the factory. In this case, the default one is OK, is business. We're going to press enter, and you can see that a lot of files have been created. Let's take a look inside the folder. You can see here that we have the business layer already created for us, and the reader has been created inside a folder with the name of the entity. So the code is like this because we could have more than one entity inside the Antelope module. But if we have only one entity, for example, if we're going to manage only the Antelope in this module, we could just drag this Antelope folder or the reader folder out of the Antelope folder onto the business layer. Okay, we could just drag and drop and delete the reader folder if we don't want to group the entities and we just want to have a reader. And now we can delete the Antelope folder and the reader would be in the main business folder. So this is up to you if you want to manage more than one entity inside the module, then you could create the entity folder, and inside the entity folder then you would create the reader, the writer, the updater, the deleter. In this case, we're managing the Antelope, but if we decide, let's suppose that from now on, we decide to also manage the Antelope type and the Antelope location creations and reading part in this main module, then we could leave the reader the way it was. So let's go back and recreate again the reader. As you can see, the factory also creates the facade and the facade interface. It doesn't add any method. We can add the method for getting the data from the reader. So here in the business factory, you can see that it creates an instance of the Antelope reader, and then it injects the repository that is automatically read by Spryker. With this method here, you can see it automatically locates the repository of the module, and the repository would be inside the persistence layer. So we don't have to do it ourselves. This repository is automatically located by Spryker and injected into the reader. So another thing that is going to be passed is the Antelope expanders plugins in case we have expanders. Expanders are pieces of code that we can add as plugins in order to enhance the data that is returned from the reader. You can see here, we don't have this method, so we're not going to use any expanders here. So only the repository we're going to inject. So let's open the reader and let's take a look inside. So we don't need any expanders here, so we don't inject the expander. Those expanders could be taken from the dependency provider, for example, and injected inside the reader by the factory. Here we can just use the inline type hinting here, already available in PHP, and we can remove it from the class, and we wouldn't need to add it here. So the constructor is lean in this way. So here also the PHP docs comments are automatically added, even though PHP already knows that the Antelope repository is of this type. So it's a little bit redundant, but it is automatically done by the scripts. So here we have the get collection method that returns an Antelope collection transfer. And you can see that it calls the repository, and then it calls get Antelope collection. That's why we created the method with this name. If we just click on this method, you can see that we go directly into the persistence layer and you can see that our method is automatically called by the reader. So here we just return the Antelope collection transfer because we don't need any plugins added to our code. Otherwise, we would have passed the Antelope transfer into the plugin stack. We can just inline this return type here. And here you can see the execute expander. It would go through all of the Antelope expanders if we provide those expanders through the dependency provider, for example, and then inject those expanders into the reader. It would go and iterate through the expander and call the method expand on every expander. So we don't need that code, but it's good to know that we have this possibility out of the box from the Spryker. So now we have the reader. We have to expose this method in the Facade. So the Facade was already created. We have a command also for adding a method to the Facade. I'm going to show it to you. Let's call the method that we're going to add in the Facade in the same way that we have it here. We're going to receive an Antelope criteria transfer in the Facade, and then that Facade could be used in some other layers or in some other modules. The command would be add z-business facade method, or it could be add business interface facade method. If we execute this command, then we have to input, we have to tell what module we're talking about. In this case, the module is Antelope. Then the application of this Facade, of course, it is Z. Then the Facade method. So we're going to use the same method, get Antelope collection. Then the output of that method, in this case, is the same as the get Antelope collection from here, from the reader. So we're going to paste this. And then the method for the interface Facade. So we're going to add the same method. So let's just press enter and enter. Let's open the Facade, and you can see that the method is here, okay, the get Antelope collection and the return type. It's up to us to implement that method. You can see also here the interface, and you can see that even though we didn't have the Antelope config and an Antelope dependency provider, these two classes were automatically added by the script. Why? Because we might need to inject some dependencies into the module, for example, the expanders for the reader, etc. And we could configure some parameters. So this Antelope config class and Antelope dependency provider are automatically located by Spryker when we load this module. So now the only thing that we need to do is just to create an instance of the reader from here, from the factory. And we have access to this method, get factory, get repository, get entity manager, but we don't need this method here in the Facade because we have those methods inside the business factory. So at this point, we just need to call this get factory, and this would automatically return an instance of the Antelope business factory. So we type hinted also that the factory is the one inside the business folder and not the default one from Spryker. So in this case, we can call create Antelope reader, and you can see from the create Antelope reader that then the repository is going to be injected here in the factory. So the Facade doesn't need to pass the repository there. And then we can call get Antelope collection and just pass the Antelope criteria transfer. Okay, at this point, we just return the result from that method. And here we need to use this parameter here because it would be a parameter that the consumer would pass to the Facade in order to call this method. So it would be Antelope criteria transfer. Let's import this type, and let's add also this type into the Facade interface. So the Spryker's command didn't ask for the parameter, so we have to add it ourselves. We import the Antelope collection transfer. Let's verify that everything is working. So now we have everything wired up. We have the Facade, that is the public face to the outer world, to other modules and to other layers. Through this Facade, we can call the get Antelope collection from the Antelope reader. Let's just fix this issue here by importing the right transfer here, Antelope collection transfer. Okay, and now you can see that everything is okay. All right, now we have the business layer ready for the reader. We decided to have the entities grouped by folder. So we have a folder for the Antelope, and then we could just add also the business logic and the persistence logic for the Antelope type and Antelope location inside the Antelope folder, because those entities depend on Antelope. If there is no Antelope entity, for example, then we wouldn't have any Antelope location or Antelope type. This is a decision. We could just separate those modules. As I told you before, we could just extract the reader from the Antelope folder and then have a folder structure with business and then reader, updater, writer, deleter at business layer if we have just one entity to manage. So in this case, we're going to manage every entity inside the business folder as a folder.